Hello everybody, welcome to the PMO SIG webinar from the Association for Project Management. My name's Mike Belch. I'm going to be your host today. I am now going to hand over in a second to Dion. We asked Dion to come along to talk about this subject, project saboteurs. This is us being a little disruptive. This is us looking at not the latest technique for fancy reporting or stakeholder management, and not the usual PMO topic, but it's actually something that, if you're like me and you're a glass half full person, if your default position is trust, it can be quite shocking to see that there are people out there, both within and without your project, who don't necessarily want it to succeed. Hopefully we can get some good examples through the presentation, but it's nice to stir things up occasionally, and I think for all of us, the presentation is going to do just that. So Dion, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good afternoon. Very lovely occasion to talk to you about project sabotage, and I think it's as you said, an interesting subject, because it's not the common thing. It's a bit off the beaten track that we'll be talking about. I hope it's going to be an interesting afternoon. There we are, the phenomenon of deliberately undermining projects. That's what you just announced, that it's a different subject from the usual getting control and grip on your project. It's a bit of a different view on how projects go. I've started the subject a while ago while I was a project director at ING Bank, and I wondered why projects that I planned didn't go as they were planned. And the first reaction, of course, then is one of a more technical background, saying, oh my dear, you might have your resources not in place, or your planning or finance might not be in order. But it showed that even if you had those, let's say, more technical issues well organized, then still projects failed. And that puzzled me so much that a long time ago I started to think about that there must be something behind this all, and that has brought me to thinking about project sabotage as a phenomenon, as I said, of deliberately undermining projects. The agenda for the coming webinar is that we will look on project management and the human factor, what we will probably be talking about. I will show you a few hints, a few examples, how to see when a project is being manipulated, so you get more alerted to this phenomena. And that takes you into the mindset of the saboteur. How does it work? Why does he act as he acts? When I say he, of course, she is a possibility as well. Now, in order not to leave you in distress and say, oh dear, there's sabotage all over the place, there is also a few slides on how to deal with it, because you can absolutely deal with sabotage, and I've called that counter sabotage, in order to leave you more assured than when you would have just the first part of the presentation. Now, basically, and I think Mike already mentioned something about that, you could have two views at project management, the technical part and the human part, and that brings us to soft controls and hard controls. Now, there's nothing as hard as soft controls, someone said a while ago, because they are usually not very well presented or not very well shown, but they are very much there. It's easier to talk about the hard controls, because then you talk about figures, about things you can measure, things you can almost touch, but the soft controls might not be visible, but they are absolutely important. And what I've learned so far is that despite the fact that you've got your hard controls perfectly organized, it might be that your soft controls still worry your project and take care of failure. We could talk about tone at the top, attitude, people's interest, things like that, and they are more important than you would think. I hope you can join me in thinking about how this works. One of the interesting things that in almost all literature is that projects, IT projects particularly, tend to fail. And the figures are rather disappointing. There's an investigation done by Ernst & Young. They say that 6 out of 10 IT projects fail completely or partially. And the Standard Group has a very nice tradition in producing their chaos reports. And on the whole, they say 28 of the project succeeds. And I consider that to be a low number. And certainly, if we look at this from an APM point of view, you should be able to have more success than that. Now, let me tell you how the standards group defines success. They effectively have three categories. The first is, does a project succeed? The second is it challenged? And the third is a project successful? Now, only 28% succeeds, and they define success as within time, within budget, and delivering what has been expected. So that means on these three traditional parameters, you decide whether a project has succeeded or not. And if one of these doesn't, then they consider the project not to be successful. Now, as I said, there's a very low percentage, 28%, despite many trainings all over the world on project management, and despite all the efforts that the ABM does as well. Now, it could be that the danger is coming from a different angle than where you would expect it to be. And that, of course, relates to the fact that the hard controls are more visible than the soft controls. Now, on the next slide, you see how the standards group has developed their chaos reports over the years. And the slide ends a while ago, but even in recent years, in 2018, the latest report appeared. And it's still very much in line with what you see here, that the 28%, 30% is successful. A lot of projects being challenged, so that it's possible that they succeed, but they might not. And a huge amount of projects simply fails. So if we take this to the UK, you could see about the same percentage. There is a report that's on this slide saying that there is 31% of the projects that failed, which is a huge number. In the introduction, you could see that if you relate this to money worldwide, there's a lot of money involved in projects that fail. And to give you a few examples, most of these examples probably are well known. The National Audit Office, they warned that a third, again, about the same 30%, that should be completed over the next 5 years, are also bound to fail. And of course, you know far better than I do from the continent the examples, like the London's Barbican Centre, estimated £8 million, over 187 million, and the other examples like the Jubilee Line and British Library are well known. Now, this is not something that just happens in the UK. To be completely honest, I'm a Dutch citizen, and we have a high-speed link that tripled the budget before being finished. There is the Amsterdam subway with huge problems in terms of finance and result. So there is quite a lot of projects not delivering in time or overrunning in terms of money. And it could be even worse than that. The worst thing that I've seen for projects failing is that there is a project recently delivered by the FBI in the US, and based on what they usually call a sort of crime fighters myth, the FBI has now acknowledged that they have falsified proof to get the suspects convicted. And this is one thing, but in 14 cases, a death sentence has been executed. So that means that there must be some sort of a driver that caused these crime fighters to falsify proof and to send people to to heaven. Okay, now if we look at the causes of failure, why do projects fail? Then if you look at project management audits, you will usually find a lot of reasons that you will recognize. If, for instance, your requirements are incomplete or they do not exist at all, then of course it's very difficult to complete your projects in time. The same applies to scope creep. If your scope is unstable, it's very, very difficult to deliver the results in time. And the same applies to bad communication. If your project is isolated and not communicating properly with the environment, then you will probably see that the project has a risk of failure. And of course, inadequate resources in terms of money as well as in terms of people is also a well-known cause of failure. Bad planning, that is, I think, pretty obvious. If your plan is not adequate, it's very difficult to deliver in time. Inadequate risk control is something that is relevant as well. If there are risks, but you don't identify them, or you have a reluctancy to identify risks and not to mitigate, then as we all know, the problem will continue to exist. A very important thing, of course, what you will find in most management methods is define your result properly. If you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter if you get there, said Lewis a while ago. So if you don't have an idea of your result, it's very difficult to define that you are not getting there. And of course, based on the experience that probably you all have, you can add a few causes to this list. Now, interesting for this webinar, of course, is that you miss usually a project sabotage and soft controls. So the actual issue is what is behind all this. So it's not a matter of do we have causes of failure, it's more a matter of understanding what is behind these causes of failure. Why were there adequate resources in your project? And why was the planning not adequate? Or why did the risk control not deliver what they should have delivered? I think that is an important thing. What is behind all this? Because we have seen, and I think the Standish report shows this pretty nicely throughout the years, that despite the best effort that we all take, the success rate of project is not going up very rapidly. Now, the point is that project failure exists, and the reasons behind that are different than just the technical issues. Because you would find in any project people who could benefit from a different result than the official result that the project shows. That they will benefit from undermining the project, and they work pretty hard to do so. And so far, this is something that has not been brought to the attention of everybody. And I think I will come in a while on why that is, because you usually focus on the beauty of things rather than on the ugliness of things. Looking at the reasons why this happens, there is a Dutch professor, and he has investigated what position people take in these matters. And his statement is that 1% of the population is corrupt, which means that based on their moral standards, they have no or very low moral standards, and there's nothing you can do about that. Completely on the other side, you will find 1% that is completely honest. And those are the people that, because of, for instance, religious reasons, have no reason at all to sabotage your projects. They simply are honest and work along, they do what they say. So those are two very different moral standards. Now, it's not very difficult to compute that 98% is left. And the statement then is that 98% decides on his position based on the situation that they encounter. So that means that they have the possibility of being either honest or not being honest based on the interest that they have. I think that is a key issue for understanding how this runs, because you might have an inclination to not being completely honest simply because there is a benefit for you in a project. I will give you comments on why people act like that. Well, the first reason, of course, is that people might have a reason in terms of promotion. They might have a reason in terms of status. It could as well be their employment. And let me give you an example. Suppose you're in a department that is faced by an IT project that's going to change the complete department, and you might lose your job and you're part of that project. Then we all understand that the attitude that that specific person might have towards that project is not a very positive one. And the reaction could be twofold. The reaction could be, oh dear, I might just as well look for a different job. Or the reaction could be, I might as well try to stop this project, or at least try to delay the project so I can look around for a different job. So that means that the interest that people have decides upon their position in that specific project. Now, the funny thing is, if you look at project management training, usually project management trainings are on the beaten track, which means that they usually focus very much on what the hard controls are. So we focus on the figures, resources, on planning, on the financial issues, but the human factor, as I've mentioned in the very beginning, is something that we do not see very much. And the reason for that lies, for instance, within a nice booklet that I read a while ago. It's from Umberto Eco, an Italian, and the book, also in English available, says, as a title, The History of Ugliness. And his idea is that we tend to focus on the beauty. His book is the first book talking about the history of ugliness instead of the history of beauty, of arts, or whatsoever. And he lists all sorts of examples of ugliness. Now, the tendency we have is not to focus on that, but we focus on the beauty. And project success, of course, is the beauty, and project failure is the ugliness. One of the reasons why, despite the fact that those two contrast and therefore both get some more body, despite that fact, we do not focus that much on ugliness, despite the fact that it could help you in focusing on that in order to make projects more successful. Now, we have to be careful in the sense of there is a nuance as well, because you all have information on resistance to change, which is in terms of change management, a quite well-known phenomena as well. And sabotage is linked to that. It looks like resistance to change, but there is quite a difference. The difference is that resistance to change has a passivity around itself. It's passive. People don't like to change and they don't move. So they don't take an active attitude. We simply see a passive attitude. Sabotage, by contrast, is something that requires an active attitude. People have to do something in order to steer the project results in a different direction than where they go, in the direction, namely, that suits them best. So sabotage requires an active attitude of people, and resistance to change requires not an active attitude of people at all. Another difference is that there is a lot of literature on resistance to change and very little literature on sabotage. Also, because people have the tendency, like Mike said in the beginning, I tend to trust people. People tend to trust people, which is, of course, a very nice positive attitude. The point is, some people simply do not deserve your trust. So the second bullet says that I consider it to be sabotage if the project is deliberately being undermined, whilst resistant to change is more of a passive attitude. Another thing to clarify what we're talking about is that incompetence does occur. Quite a lot of projects suffer from incompetence in whatever area, but we don't call that sabotage. It's something that is a risk in your project, but it's not something that we can call sabotage. And of course, I have to tell you that I exaggerate in the sense that there is small manipulation and there is bigger manipulation to completely destroying a project. So from small changes to stopping the project completely, but the whole, I've called that sabotage. And as a result of the word and the articles and the books I wrote about it are available now in many countries, in many languages. So it's a more of a catchy term than calling it a small manipulation or something. So that's why I choose to call it sabotage. Now, to give you a few examples on smaller and bigger ways of sabotaging the project, small manipulation could be that the British Rail is trying to make a new itinerary in your back garden, and by manipulating the project, for instance, by introducing a protected species in the environment, British Rail decides to make the track slightly further away from your back garden. So I wouldn't call that big sabotage. There's more manipulation, costs money to British Rail, but it does serve the interest of the owner of that specific garden. Now, bigger sabotage actions are possible as well, which could lead to simply projects not starting at all or not being successful at all, and therefore huge costs. Thereby, huge costs are involved. And maybe a few words on how this works in order to help you to identify this once you look this afternoon or tomorrow in your environment and think about this webinar and might have a question on, oh dear, is there a sabotage in my environment? One of the ways to sabotage a project is on the finance involved. I've a lot of experience within the Dutch government as well as with the financing industry. And the tendency they have is, in order to reduce the risk, is to produce a business case. Now, probably you've all seen business cases, but I've rarely seen a business case that is not positive. And the result is that a project will start. Now, if you look very thoroughly to these business cases, then sometimes even these business cases have been manipulated to the extent that they are positive. And that could be in the quantitative area as well as in the qualitative area. And sometimes if a project is too expensive, we will see the quantitative elements like high productivity, better security, better efficiency go up to the extent that it covers all the expenses of the specific project. An interesting question would then be, are there authors of the business case who have an interest in presenting the business case as positive as it is? It could be that, for instance, the project manager is pushed or willing to get the project going, and the last thing he would have is a negative business case, so he can't start. That could be an issue of turnover, if he has his origin in a consulting company, or it could be simply his pride and his eagerness to start and be a successful project manager. So that could be a reason why finance is being manipulated in order to get the project started. To do that, the saboteur has to have access to the data, has to have a motive, and has to have an opportunity to do that. So if you look at these aspects, it is possible to identify that someone is manipulating the financial part. Another possible way of sabotaging your project lies within the user. The user, and you might have experienced that as well as I have a few years ago, is coming up with new requirements all the time. I've been building a huge IT system for ING Group, and every time when we delivered in a nice agile fashion, we delivered a new piece of software, they would say, oh dear, I forgot something, there is a new legislation coming along, so we have to redo the whole thing. And this turned into a pattern. It was not just a one-time issue where they came up with changing the requirements, but it returned all the time. So time after time, the requirements were changed. And after a while, we have looked into the background of these users, and it was clear that they were influenced in a negative way by this new project. So they had no intention at all to support that. The third person who could be possibly potentially a saboteur is the specialist. Now, I've seen a lot of software architects And these software architects sometimes make the architecture immensely difficult. And first of all, I thought it was my understanding that I couldn't follow what they wrote down. But second thoughts were that they have made the architecture over complicated in order to come to a situation where there's only one person who understands the architecture, exactly the author of the whole thing. And if this is someone from a commercial firm, you might think that turnover is pushing him to deliver an architecture that is more complex than you actually need for your project. Now, and the last example that I would like to call the attention to is the Workers' Council. The Workers' Council probably rather obviously sometimes shows that they do not agree with the plan that the management has put forward, and that they simply want to change the plans that they have seen because they focus on different things like full employment rather than on the change issue. It is important to see that a saboteur doesn't stick out. He is someone who is part of the project, who plans, who collaborates nicely, and is part of the project organization. And in wording, in his words, in his behavior, he supports the projects very nicely, and he uses the characteristics of the project in order to manipulate the project. So in order to identify the saboteur, it's not that easy because he won't walk around with a sign on his back saying that he is this week's saboteur. Now, I've already said before, quoting Einstein, that incompetence is there, and Einstein said that only two things in his thinking were infinite: the universe and the human stupidity, and he was not completely sure about the universe. So it does exist, but it has to be seen as separate from sabotage. Now, in order not to leave you worried, it is possible, once you've acknowledged that it does happen, to see what you could do to counter the problem that I've been describing in the last 30 minutes. The first thing is something that was mentioned already in the beginning by Mike, which is trust. We tend to trust people until the opposite has come about. Well, I would change that a little bit. There's nothing wrong with, let's say, a sound sort of inquiry attitude. So I would say that we have to admit that there are non-benevolent project participants. Not all participants in your project have the same wonderful idea to support your project. Depends very much what their interest is in the project. And the ideal situation is that the interest of your project members is completely aligned with the interest of the project as a whole. That's the ideal situation. As we all know, the ideal world is not where we live in. So project failure is not just incompetence. It could be that someone is sabotaging a project because they don't support the goal. If you would improve the success rate of projects, then it's important to add this element to what we do in project management. So my idea is not that we have to change the complete project management toolkit and to switch 100% over to counter-sabotage. The idea is that you have your toolbox in terms of resources, in terms of planning, etc., but you add something to this. And the add-on is something based on a slight mistrust, based on the idea that it's not just structure that counts, but as we said in the beginning, it's also about culture, behavior, self-control, and also very much about the interest that people have in the project they support or simply do not support. Based on these thoughts, there could be several measures. What we know, of course, is that there is a standard tool called stakeholder analysis, and usually the stakeholder analysis is executed in a rather technical way. which means that you identify the background of people, you identify his position in the organization, and you take care of taking them along in your project execution. Now, interesting would be to see if your stakeholder has a certain interest in your project, and that could be a positive interest or it could be a negative interest in your project. So if you would add this to your stakeholder analysis, that could deepen your knowledge on the players that you've got on board. I'll give you an example of that. I, a while ago, gave a lecture for project managers talking about project sabotage. And one of these managers said to me, well, that doesn't happen in my project. I've got absolutely trustworthy people working very hard and, well, things are running very nicely. I said, how is your project going along? Are you on track and on schedule? And he said, no, we are not on track. And then he explained that he was introducing a fiberglass network for a big community somewhere in Germany. And this fiber network was going to replace the copper network that was there beforehand. And the people working on the fiber network were the exact technicians that were responsible for the maintenance of the copper network. And there already you can see some sort of relation between the two issues. So I've asked him, who is going to be responsible for the maintenance of your new fiber network? And he said, well, I haven't been part of the selection, but they have selected some sort of Japanese company, and they will do the maintenance of the fiber network once it's done. And I said, okay, and what will happen to these copper guys? He simply didn't consider it at all. And of course, immediately after a while, he understood that these copper guys were not as well intended as he might have thought. They were simply delaying the project in order to assure their employment. Now, the measure was relatively simple. The first step was that the project manager had to acknowledge that not everybody is trustworthy. That's the first step. So it's a matter of view on the world. And the second step is that I suggested him to offer these copper guys a fantastic training up in California somewhere that would make them a high specialist on IT and data communication, a education they would never have earned in a regular way, on one condition, that they would make the project finish in time, which is exactly what he did, and which is exactly what happened. So the danger of destroying the project was thereby neutralized. And that more or less illustrates the motive for sabotage. Once you know what this example, the maintenance crew for the copper network, what their intention is, what their motive is, then you can talk about measures and see how you can make the sabotage activities stop. It's quite important not to blow the whistle before you do a careful analysis. We all know that the whistleblowers do not end very successfully all the time. The organization usually turns itself against the whistleblowers because they tend to question the success of the organization. So it's very important to do a careful analysis before you identify someone or a group of persons as saboteurs. And in line with that, it's quite important not to inform the wrong person, or thereby you will just have one a victim of the whole operation, which is yourself. Now, if I take just 5 minutes to summarize where we were, and then we can switch to the Q&A part. The first thing that I try to talk to you about is that it does exist. And although we've only spent a short time on it, and my idea is that project failure cannot only be explained by the more obvious reasons that we have seen on the slides, which were the regular, well-known reasons like resources, planning, scope creep, things like that, why projects fail. There is another dimension to be added to this, which is the art of project sabotage. It is relevant for project success to recognize them, and not just doing that, but take your measures. The measure in case of this fiber network was relatively cheap. Delaying the project day per day takes a lot of money, and giving these copper maintenance guys in this example an expensive training is far cheaper, very efficient investment. Let's say that it would take 10,000 euros, 10,000 pounds a person. That's not enough if you have a, let's say, 5 to 10 number of maintenance staff. That would easily guess to say that it is well invested amount of money. So measures are absolutely possible. I think it is important to state that the regular and, let's say, traditional technical project management, nothing wrong with that at all. The only thing that I would suggest is that something is added to this, and that would be a view, an open mind to the fact that some people might have an interest in destroying the project, but they have a different interest than the project has. And let me be clear, there's nothing psychologically wrong with it. It's quite explainable that people who do not have the interest that you have in the project, they simply do not follow your interest. So, Mike, I think we are running up to 40 minutes now. Maybe you could take it from here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, Dion. Interestingly, just that very last point that you made about people not necessarily agreeing with your perspective, I had a correction from Russ online, a very, very good and very, very pertinent correction that in the case that you quoted of a railway track and people's objections because of the need to protect flora and fauna, that in itself is not sabotage. That's people rightly protecting the environment. So I think sometimes perception can mean that project teams can go on the defense and they can see external objections, or even sometimes internal objections, as sabotage, when actually it can be nothing of the sort. So that was a really interesting interjection from Russ, and I appreciate it. I appreciate that.
Okay, lovely. Could I read to that briefly? Yeah,
please do.
That brings some more relevance to the discussion indeed, so thank you very much. The idea, of course, is that if you suffer from this railroad track in your neighborhood, there is two ways of dealing with it. One is the official open way of making an official objection to the community or to the railroad society, saying, I have a protest and my reasons are blah, blah, blah. The other non-openly way would be that you introduce, for instance, there is a Tatterjack toad, I think, which is a protected sort of animal, and there is a hamster, which is another famous protected animal. And what we have seen is that some people import these animals. They are widely available in the former Eastern Germany, and they put these hamsters and the toad in the area and say, oh dear, this is a protected animal in an environment you simply can't build here because the environment, the flora and fauna has to be respected. So that is the non-open way of dealing with it, which I would call a simple way of manipulation, a relatively innocent way of sabotage. But there is a difference between openly and not openly dealing with your railroad track.
Yeah, and that's classic sabotage. And I have to say that I have seen a very, very real example of that recently, where one of the last projects I looked at, after multiple environmental surveys gave the all clear, one suddenly found protected great crested newts in a pond where they had never been seen before. Let's move on anyway. So a question from Samuel, or an observation from Samuel, we'll see what you think. He says we found that by adopting Scrum development, it eliminates many of the reasons for project failure, and almost all of the concerns mentioned are resolved with agile programming. So do you see this kind of agile programming, the fact that you're involving the whole project team and talking to the whole project team on a daily basis, that agile approaches may be less susceptible to this kind of sabotage?
I think I have to disappoint Samuel. He's right in terms of the short cycle that you would then have and reduce the risk of not presenting the result in time. But the interesting thing is that an agile way of working still allows sabotage to have it their way. The first thing is management is very different in agile teams than from traditional project teams, where all team members are project managers. Sorry. The second thing is the backlog. Who decides what will be on the backlog and what will be on the to-do list? And a very important thing is that if you talk about compliance and architecture, those are two, let's say, relatively weak elements in agile way of working. They tend not to be at the top of mind. And if they are not, then you could easily use these two elements to make your project successful on the short term, which is absolutely possible with agile. But if you then try to fit in your part of your software development to the bigger puzzle, then you would really have a puzzle if the architecture and compliance is not in the right position. So I think that Samuel is right, that some of the elements of agile reduce the risk of not producing in time, but we have to watch governance in agile teams and security as well as compliance and architecture in order to make those projects successful. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, cool. So Stacy asks, how do PMs identify whether they are facing incompetence or sabotage?
Yeah, the distinction is difficult. It's all about the interest that people have. If a person simply is not delivering the right products, for instance, you have an architect who is not delivering the right project, the right products, and it could be that he simply doesn't know what he's doing. But if there is a pattern, and if he has an interest, for instance, his employment in the project to keep going, then despite the fact that he delivers the right projects and the right products, then he might have an interest on staying on board for a while. So the difference lies in checking the quality of his products or his deliverables on one hand, and on the other hand, it would be useful to verify the background. Has he got an employment reason for doing that? Has he got a turnover reason for it? Or is he in financial heavy weather that he has to have his turnover in order to survive and feed the kids?
Okay, Mike asks, and it's really the same question, but a slightly different spin. You know, it's difficult to identify saboteurs because sometimes they can simply be people who are less knowledgeable. So maybe that's unconscious incompetence. You know, how do you really spot and know the difference then?
Yeah, but maybe to add a few things, just one thing to that. It is absolutely useful to identify the background of people, and of course, it's useful to hire the right staff. But I would say there is two approaches to it: hiring the right staff and assessing their qualities is one area. The other area is identifying the background and interest of people. And answering those two questions probably helps you making the difference between the two.
Okay, Christy Lee asks, what can be done if the saboteur is reported to top management, but they choose to ignore that behavior and it continues, even when evidence is provided of their activities?
Yeah, I think that is a good question, because if you would then continue as a sort of integrity officer and say, oh dear, this is absolutely the wrong way to do this, and probably the downside will be that all negative effects come back to yourself. So if there is no agreement in your organization that this is something that can not be done, not be tolerated, then the best way is to stop it, despite the fact that I've tried to make the subject more lively and more relevant. That would bring you to a very difficult position. So I would then try to see if other people in the organization could share your worries, and then would be able to take steps even towards senior management. But being a soloist in this field is very, very dangerous. So as I said, a whistleblower has to be very careful.
Cool, thanks. My good friend Sanchana asks, and a number of other people have asked actually, if you could make public your way of doing this kind of stakeholder analysis, this sort of positive negative approach, because existing stakeholder management tools are probably just not up to it. Some sort of example would be excellent if we could have it, or you could point us towards it.
Yeah, I think the first thing we would do then is make a difference between are you identifying your members before the project starts or during? Now, if you could identify for instance, the members of the steering committee and the members of the project team before you start and identify their interests, that would be of great help, because you could then, without any harm or any damaging to persons, you could say, right, you might not have the right interest to be in the steering committee. On the other hand, if you have got a project that runs already, it's far more expensive and far more difficult to change a steering committee member. It causes a lot of uproar and difficulty. So I would say that it is quite useful to follow the preventive action by identifying interests of people before the project starts, rather than during the execution of a project. An interest could be a very simple thing. It could be that career-wise, a project steering committee member is not the right person to be in this project for a while. Well, in that case, there is a conflict of interest, and you might ask the person to step down and another person take his place. An example, we've seen a member of the community of Amsterdam who was project manager of this metro project, and he had a personal interest of having his name on one of the stops, one of the stations.
Wow.
And this was his driver to falsify the finance. So, well, I think we should be very careful about that.
So interestingly, Matt asks, how can we capture and manage a conflict of interest using our PM toolkit? I think it follows on from the last question. It's what's a good stakeholder management toolkit that takes all this into account and allows us to capture people's positions, allows us to capture their conflict of interest, and what are not just the spreadsheet, but the techniques for identifying and capturing.
Well, the value of the question, yeah. Well, the value of the question is that there are many stakeholder analysis methods available, but they usually lack a specific interest element. So what I suggested that we not develop a completely new stakeholder toolkit, but we take an existing one that has a sort of proven technology idea, and then add the element of interest and see if people have an interest that is in line with the interest of the project. So that could help a lot, I think.
Again, if you have any specific examples or templates you could point any of us to, it would be quite interesting. So Georgina and Shoshana both ask, what happens in the situation where your project executive, your project sponsor, is a saboteur or is the saboteur?
Yeah, the first funny thing is it happens, which is funny because sometimes your project sponsor is not served by a project result. That is the first interesting question. Is his personal interest in line with the interest of being the sponsor, which relates also to the stakeholder part, of course. So suppose that he is, then there are several ways. The first way is to see if other participants in the project have the same idea, and if you could convince him that he has to step down. if this is not possible, then again, it's very difficult to change the situation as it is because he's high up in the sky. Of course, the person being your sponsor is probably never the last person. Suppose that he is what position he is probably not the last position. It could be the director, it could be a managing director, it could be a board even above that. So you could not only talk to him, but also talk to his peers as well, to his higher management level in terms of the executive board.
And another tooling question, but I think this is a really good one from Ashok. He'd like to make up a checklist of saboteur behaviors. That sounds really good. What does saboteurs look like? What do saboteurs do? What are the 10 or 20 things we should be looking for? I'm not asking for a list from you now, but again, is there such a thing in existence, or is it something as a community we could work together and come up with? You know, this is what bad people do and look like.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good question indeed, because I've got a tool for that, which is based on the risk that your project is subject of sabotage. And that risk is based on a few elements. The first element is your company. Has your company a good track record in terms of project management? The second is the project itself. And the third is the person. So on these three levels, I've identified a few questions to help you to see if you have a risk, because I think that is the right approach. You might think in terms of risk. Do we have a risk that we have project sabotage in our organization? And following this, I think it's like 15 questions. If you follow these 15 questions, you get sort of rating saying that you either are high in the rating of having a risk, or either have a low risk rating. So it's not difficult to send you this questionnaire.
From Kerry, I think this is great. Would the political and social categories in a pestle analysis, for those who don't necessarily remember pestle, political, economical, sociological, technological, legal, and environmental factors that influence a project from the outside. So would looking at the political and social aspects be a good starting point in looking for potential for potential saboteurs and sabotage?
Yeah, I think the answer is absolutely yes, because it is very much the answer to how do you give more perspective into just project management. Why is it that project management is not giving a high rate of success? This 30% is very, very low. And part of it could be political, environmental, or whatever background that was just mentioned. So I think it's very useful to dig into the, let's say, the political reasons for doing something, or environmental reasons, in order to understand the background. And if you've got these things right on the table, you could identify the risk or take the risk. For instance, if there is a political reason for making a railroad available, then that is clearly out in the open, and you could deal with the counter actions that it invokes.
There's a saying that I love, which is, it's sometimes better to have somebody inside the tent peeing outwards than have them outside the tent peeing inwards at you. Timothy makes a really good point, a really good question here. He says, can a saboteur be used as an opportunity to actually help validate a project? So if you, and he gives the example, if a well-respected architect is purposely raising issues and appearing to try to sabotage the project, could it have some truth and be worth investigating? Should you look at bringing that person on side to help you find out what could possibly go wrong?
Well, in line with the counter-sabotage, this sounds like a double spy action, that you, which puts an extra dimension on top of what I told. So I think it can be very nicely introduce his knowledge of the issue, because he's mentioning the use of sabotage in a different way. So I think he's right. And if we could go to the second maturity level, understanding saboteurs, I think we would very successful because we then have mastered the first rather obvious phase, and he shows that he's already in maturity level number 2.
Good, fantastic. An observation from Deborah, and thanks for this, Deborah. I find these BCS business analysis templates helpful in identifying stakeholder interests, and she lists a number of those templates. Can I suggest, Deborah, that you join in on the PMO SIG LinkedIn group and you actually list those on there? We'll probably list them as well, but if you could go on, I think it would be really good to sort of initiate a discussion around those. So let's see, we've got 1 minute. Let's have some comments. So Cheryl, thank you. That was fascinating. I'm glad to know that I'm not being paranoid when I have identified some deliberate undermining behavior. Now I know that it's a real issue. I can treat it seriously and manage it more effectively. A comment from Ioannis, and I apologize for mispronouncing that. Very useful indeed. A typical list of sabotage behaviors. So folks, that brings us to an end of today. We got through about 50% of the questions, which is fantastic. We will be sending the list of questions. We've captured them all in Excel through the tool. We'll be sending those to Dion. He'll answer them and we'll bring them back onto the LinkedIn group. So please do engage with the rest of your fellow PMO SIG members, you know, and do also look at APM website. As an APM member, you can enjoy a whole range of benefits, you know, free entry and discounted entry into various good practice events, learning from others, supporting your CPD. You know, these webinars are not the only way that you can improve your professional competence. So thank you. Thanks, Dion. Really, really appreciate your time, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.